if you actually have different people speaking, it becomes even richer. One perspective, you can only go so far. I always thought my parents, they would just live forever, right? But because my father passed away and I didn't get to say goodbye, I ended up spending a lot of time with my mother because I now realize that time is very precious.
How do you feel?
Good.
Okay. When you were putting those pieces together, what were you thinking about?
I was thinking about what would make the most sense in terms of how to arrange it. So I started off with like the dreams and keeping it more light, and then basically going from childhood more to adult, and then going back more into the part about my mother's life and starting from the beginning of that. But I wanted to not have so much of the same poetry at the beginning, because I think that and right now I think that what I found is I was writing a lot of poetry recently that goes into that manuscript, and I was writing one type of poetry, and so that's why I started writing about the orange, because I wanted to break back and try to get more of the childlike feel and get more of the imagery and more of that sense of wonderment that you have when you're a child. So I wanted to pull back out because I was making it a little bit too factual almost.
You've made several references to the same poem. What is the same poem?
I guess it wasn't exactly the same poem, but it's more like a poem that focuses on the relationship between me and my mother, but also focusing more on her life. And so I felt like when I get into that more factual way of narrative, in terms of writing, I just get a bit too factual. And I don't focus as much on the imagery and the emotions. Because if you look at some of my other poems, like Lotus Leaves or Washing Grandmother's Hair, it's very sensual, very there's something more going on than just giving the history of what happened, with her grandmother or her mother, especially her mother. There's a lot of tension there with her mother, who loves mahjong. Mom always talks about that. But yeah, it seems like when I get into more of that mode, it's a different type of poetry that comes out. And so right now I'm wanting to break out from that. I'm also wanting to experiment a bit more with form. So with the orange poem, I'm experimenting a bit more with having space in between. That way there's a bit more of a break. And it's almost like you can let more light into the poem. And I felt very different when I wrote that poem. Yeah.
How challenging is it to write about family members who are in the room as you're reading poems about them? Hypothetically.
I'm very lucky because my mother actually wanted to write a book on her life. And yeah. And I have your notebook now because we found it a month ago, which is great.
Oh, so she started?
Yeah, she did start, but it was more of she just wanted to write a book years ago. And so, not this past summer, but the summer before, I said, hey, this would be a great project for both of us. Yeah. And I've already written some poems about her in the past. I'm like, hey, let's do this together. And I want to hear more about your stories, and I can write a lot of poems on this because your life, her life to me is very unique and very different from the life that I've had. I mean, especially coming from Hong Kong, China, and just all of the different cultural events that happened during World War II, and then also the favoring of the sons, because she had two brothers. And that's a big piece that the mom always points out. There's a lot of favoritism in terms of the son. And she was a daughter, so
Yeah.
yeah.
So when you're writing about family, what goes into the decision to use persona versus use your own perspective?
Yeah, that's a good question. It seems like I do both. It depends. If I'm observing my mother a little bit, like that last poem, which was a lot of fun to write, I like to have myself and then referring to her so that I can build up the tension between the two people. So that works really well, I found. So that way there's an I, it's typically me, and then the her and the she is my mother. So that's how I can kind of build up the tension. Now, when I want to just have my mother, if it's just something that's from her perspective, then it'll be the I, and the I in that case will be her. And then I can build up the tension between like her mother, because there's a lot of tension there. And so I do it that way. And so the way, we talked a little bit about that at Salon, but the way we kind of try to separate it out is basically to say who the speaker is. So basically we would say for Yiling if it's for her. And then when I'm working on the manuscript, some of them will be like for Debbie, right? Or Debbie, just so that there's a bit of a break. Because otherwise it gets very confusing. I noticed that Rose in her recent book, she had, sometimes there's Rosie there, right? Or her mother. So you have to kind of change, sometimes you have to change who the subject is. And at first I was thinking actually to keep everything from her perspective. But then I realized that if you actually have different people speaking, it becomes even richer. Because then you have multiple perspectives. Yeah.
Do you think that comes at the cost of going deeper from one perspective?
I think that one perspective, you can only go so far. But I think that sometimes it's nice to hear it from me or from someone else. I mean, you could just do it one way, but I found that I had poems that actually, in some ways, they reach more depth when it's coming from my direction, because I know how I feel. But if I'm writing a poem about what my mother feels, then it's really trying to guess at what she feels or what she says. So there's a little bit of a disconnect, I think. But my mother and I are really close, and she always tells me what she thinks, and every poem goes through her.
That's what she thinks too. Yeah,
she's into that right now.
I know our neighbors next door are getting ready for their event for tonight, so I have one last question. So how often do you encounter, since you're writing about family, those events that are very uncomfortable to touch?
Yeah, I think the poems on my father, when he passed away, those are really hard to write. However, I have written some poems about him, just because not saying goodbye to him. And I think that, especially in that one poem, you always, at least I always thought my parents, they would just live forever, right? So I always thought, hey, there's always time to do more things. But because my father passed away and I didn't get to say goodbye, I ended up spending a lot of time with my mother, because I now realize that time is very precious. Yeah, and I'd say about maybe a year after he passed away, then I started writing some poems about the loss and what I felt after he passed away, just because in many ways it was very therapeutic to really deal with it. So I think sometimes, but I agree with you. You have to be judicious as to which events you want to put into the book or into a poem. So right now, like I said, I run it through my mother. I make sure she's okay with the ones about her, and she is. So if she says no, which she hasn't yet, then I'll definitely not present that or have that one go out.
Maybe we need to push harder then if she hasn't said no yet.
Yeah. Yeah.